Hello, my name is Yolanda Fresnillo. I'm a policy and advocacy officer on debt justice issues at Eurodat, the European Network on Debt and Development. Eurodat is a network of different CSOs from Europe, but we also work with partners all around the world, including Afrodat or OSISA in sub-Saharan Africa. I'm going to talk to you about debt justice and debt sustainability today. To start talking about debt justice, I would like to say it's actually talking about rights, about human rights, economic, social, and cultural rights. As you know, under international human rights law, states have the obligation to not only promote social progress, but to guarantee those rights. But in a global context where the neoliberal approach dominates, debt is a threat to that guarantee to human rights, because countries and governments are seeing in a situation where debt levels are rising, where debt payment is increasing, and therefore they have less and less resources to promote those human rights and economic, social, and cultural rights specifically. This is mainly due to the fact that the main answer to debt crisis and to increasing debt levels is austerity measures, and therefore cuts in public services, cuts in social protection that should be there to guarantee those human rights and economic, social, and cultural rights. You have some data in the presentation and the documents I shared with you. I'll state the case of Angola, where in 2016, more than 40% of the government revenue was being devoted to paying external debt service. This is not an exceptional case. In many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in Latin America and in Asia, and even in Europe, higher percentages of the public revenue, of the income of the government, is directly being redirected to lenders, to private and public lenders, to international financial institutions like the World Bank or the IMF, instead of being invested in public services. And this is because debt has always priority. This means that when debt becomes unsustainable, when debt levels become too high and are engulfing higher percentages of government revenue, what happens is that the governments are forced, or maybe not forced, they are willing to cut on public services and on social protection. This is through their own neoliberal approach to the management of the public issues, but also through IMF conditionalities, IMF bailouts. The consequence of that is a decline in human rights protection, and especially in women's rights and gender equality. I'm saying that because there is an important relationship between debt justice and gender justice. Unsustainable debts and neoliberal austerity as a response to the crisis are actually a threat to women's rights and to gender justice. They have been a threat for many years, for many decades now, and they are still a threat now, and especially in the coming years, as it seems a new wave of austerity is actually coming as a response to the unfurling debt crisis. Cuts in essential services, in social protection, in food or energy, subsidies, actually affect women disproportionately. Women tend to be more concentrated in lower income levels of society, and they rely on those services for survival in many cases because of structural gender inequalities. Women are affected directly by budget cuts in those services as maternal health or child health care, which they specifically rely on. But also cuts on vital services for survivors of violence against women. Women also tend to be more to rely more on public jobs to get a formal job, a formal form of labor. And when there is a debt crisis, when there's difficulties to repay debt, the IMF tend to recommend public workers' wage caps, so reduction in public workers' wages and salaries. And this also affects disproportionately women. As I said, they tend to rely more on public sector for formal jobs, but also because they are concentrated in the lower levels of the public administration, and therefore those cuts affect normally these lower levels of the administration. Finally, women are the ones who carry the extra burden of care tasks. This is not because of debt, this is because of the existing inequalities. But when public services are suffering from cuts because of a debt crisis, those services that eventually the state stops providing or provides with less quality and coverage are normally undertaken by women. So as we have seen during this pandemic and during the lockdown, women tend to increase their is being put in place, and when the state stops providing public services as they should provide in a universal and quality way. No? I'm focusing on debt justice and gender justice because we normally see that the social movements interested on debt issues are those interested on economic justice. But that is an issue, an important issue for feminist movements and for women's groups. I think it's important that feminist movements are more involved in the fight for a fair resolution to the debt crisis, because that is specifically a threat to women's rights. You will find more information in the document, in the PowerPoint presentation, but I have also included in the reading list a couple of documents, texts, articles about this issue, and also the link to a webinar we organized with the Women's Working Group on Finance for Development on Debt and Gender, which I think it might be of your interest. The presentation also covers the relationship between debt justice and climate justice or environmental justice. This is something we have been denouncing for a long time. I know there is one session on ecological debt, so I won't go in depth into that issue, but I think it's important that we know that the climate vulnerabilities, so when a country is more vulnerable to climate change and to suffer from extreme weather events like hurricanes or droughts or floods due to climate change, they are also more vulnerable to debt, because normally those countries have to respond after those catastrophes with more debt, because they don't have enough resources to face the reconstruction and the recovery after the catastrophes. And what the international community offers them is loans, is more debt. And we have several examples, like, for instance, Mozambique with the Hurricane Matthew a couple of years ago. And the response from the IMF was not canceling Mozambique's debt to face the reconstruction after the destruction of the city of Beira, but to offer loans to Mozambique. So Mozambique's debt would go up. There's actually a research by the IMF themselves showing that in cases of larger scale environmental disasters, the the country's debt levels increase the next 3 years after the disaster. There's also an important issue, which is that climate vulnerabilities actually increase the cost of that debt. So when a country is especially vulnerable to climate change, they have to pay more interest rates than any other country in the same situation as this one. And a calculation made by a research said that this has translated into more than $40 billion in additional interest payments over the last 10 years for a number of 20 countries that the study was analyzing. So climate vulnerabilities can increase debt vulnerabilities, but there is also the other way around. So debt vulnerabilities can actually affect the country's capacity to deal with climate emergency challenges, because as an increasing portion of government revenue, as we have seen, is dedicated to repay external debts, there is less money available to invest in adaptation and mitigation for climate change, or to cope with extreme climate events. In this sense, Eurodad and the civil society working on debt issues have been demanding for some time now a debt payments moratoria and debt relief in the case of a climate disaster. So when a country like Mozambique is hit by a hurricane linked to climate change, their debt payments stop immediately, and then as soon as the damages evaluation is done, there is a debt relief process and debt cancellation offered to that country. Those are among the proposals that we make from the civil society to deal with these interlinkages between debt vulnerabilities and climate vulnerabilities. Another issue that I included in the PowerPoint presentation is what I called the uses of debt. I didn't know what title to put in there, but this comes from a reflection that when we approach debt issues and debt justice issues, we normally approach them from this human rights position. But when the IMF, the World Bank, the governments approach debt, they approach it as a merely technical financial issue. This means, but debt is actually not only a technical issue, not only an economic issue, but also a highly political issue. Debt has actually been used by the IFIs, by donor countries, by private financial sector to promote a certain economic model, the neoliberal model, with the centrality of the market and the shrinking of the state. Structural adjustment during the 80s and the 90s, or the present packages of austerity and the new austerity packages that might come in the following years, they have not only failed to solve the debt crisis that they were supposed to tackle, but have caused impoverishment, have been a way of promoting that economic model with imposing privatizations and public-private partnerships into these countries, and shrinking the size of the state to give a bigger portion of the cake to the private sector, so to call it. And these policies have actually benefited a few multinational corporations, normally with the headquarters in Europe and in North America, also some elites in southern countries, international investors that made the most of these privatization processes. So while people have been impoverished by debt, some people have actually gained and made a lot of profits from this debt system. I included in the presentation one paragraph of the Thomas Sankara speech at the African Union summit in 1987. It's many years ago. I think when I thought about this presentation, I immediately thought on that speech. I think there is not another text that explains so well what we mean by debt justice. And in this specific paragraph that I chose, Thomas Sankara is speaking about how the lenders are actually lending this money as if they were gambling in a casino. But when it comes the time when there are difficulties to repay the debt, they are not willing to take the risk and to take their part. And they normally ask for bailouts from the international financial institutions, and they push for this debt to be repaid even when they know human rights are being violated because of this. I mention this because this is something that is actually happening today. This speech, as I said, it was made in 1987. I just read this article explaining how BlackRock, a private investment firm, is actually increasing the lending to emerging countries, including sub-Saharan African countries, in a context, in a situation where there is clearly a debt crisis and difficulties to repay those new debts. But what happens that they are asking for higher debt interest, for higher cost of this debt. They say that this is because they are taking higher risks, which is not true. Because when it comes the moment that this risk actually blows and they cannot be repaid, they ask for bailouts. And there's the IMF and there's the official donors who actually bail out these private creditors. As I say, I insist, probably you already know this speech by Thomas Sankara. I included the link to the full speech. I highly recommend you to reread or read it if you haven't done so before, this speech, because it's strange how suitable it is for the situation we are living today, even if it was pronounced in 1987. I'm going to start finishing this presentation by talking about some of the proposals that as civil society we have been fighting for many years now. As I said before, one of the challenges in terms of dealing with a debt crisis and preventing unsustainable debt is actually the way the international financial institutions and the creditors and even the borrowing governments approach debt as a merely technical and economic issue. And this is especially relevant to the concept of debt sustainability. So for the IMF and the World Bank, for most creditors, for global institutions, and for many analysts, a debt remains sustainable as long as it can be repaid, as long as there is money in the coffers to pay that debt, even if that money is needed to fund public services, is needed to ensure the population's survival. If there is money, and that money can be destined to repay this debt, that debt is sustainable. This analysis, this approach to debt sustainability does not take into account the impacts of this debt repayment in human rights. So it does not take into account if this payment is being made at the expense of undermining public services or at cutting wages for public servants or at cutting subsidies that the poorest population rely on. The position from the civil society is that there should be a re-evaluation and re-examination of this concept of debt sustainability in a way that it should integrate development priorities. There should be independent human rights impact assessment to assess the country's ability to actually cover the needs of their population including social, gender, environment, and development considerations, before considering that a debt is sustainable. From our point of view, and for the point of view of the UN independent expert on human rights and debt, sustainability is only achieved when debt service does not result in violation of human rights. This is very basic for us, but it's not so basic when you talk to the IMF or different creditors. Together with this new approach to debt sustainability and inclusion of a human rights perspective into debt sustainability, we have been fighting and demanding for a long time a change in international financial architecture. At the present, the debt crises are being solved in a way where different creditors ally against one single borrower, one single borrowing country or debtor country. The IMF plays the role of a judge and part in debt resolution processes. Private creditors have not the obligation to participate in debt relief or debt restructure processes. So it's a sort of an ill-equipped mechanism and framework to deal with so complex debt resolution processes. What we ask for is an independent space, a multilateral space where sovereign debt crisis could be resolved following rules, transparent rules, in a fair and durable way, if possible under the auspices of the UN, so in a democratic way as well, and where the primacy of human rights over debt service payment could be ensured. I included in the reading list the document that we prepared at Eurodat called "We Can Work It Out," which includes 10 civil society principles to sovereign debt resolution. There is a summary of those principles in the PowerPoint, and if you would like to, we can discuss this proposal a bit more during the presentation at the end of September. There are many other proposals and solutions from the civil society, and we can have a wider debate on what solutions from a debt justice perspective we can have. But there is one last thing I would like to mention, which is that for anything to happen, we need more transparency from borrowing countries, but also from lender countries, from international financial institutions, and especially from private creditors, to be able to know how much debt is actually owed, from which countries to which countries or to which lenders, why this debt was created in the first place, what are exactly the budget expenditures. So transparency is very important to analyze this debt sustainability I was talking about before. So we need transparency, we need participation from civil society, we need accountability from creditors and lenders, we need strong civil society networks and social movements to make that happen, to make that accountability and transparency happen. And I know this is going to be treated in another session, but debt audits, and especially with the participation of civil society, are a great tool to actually demand and promote this transparency, this participation, and this accountability. They are a way of sensibilizing the population of what is actually the situation behind this debt crisis that a country might be going through. So I really encourage you to join these civil society organizations and social movements to promote these changes in international financial architecture and this transparency, participation, and actually this debt justice, which also means gender justice, which means environmental justice, which means social justice. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much, and I hope to talk to you. I'm really looking forward to talking to you in the session we have at the end of September. Thanks a lot.